What's the most horrible way to die that you've ever heard of that has actually happened? Serious NSFW. That guy that walked 700 meters off the boardwalk in Yellowstone with his sister and slipped into a boiling, acidic geyser comes to mind. That guy who jumped in a boiling geyser to save his dog also comes to mind. When they pulled him out, he had third-degree burns over 100% of his body while he was still alive and conscious enough to realize he f***ed. When his friend pulled him out, he said something along the lines of "That was stupid. How bad am I? I'm an idiot." Like, even though his nerve endings were probably shot pretty instantly once he was in there, the idea that he was able to realize that he was going to die is f***ed up. There was a comment on here about a worker at a steelworks who committed suicide by jumping in the molten steel crucible. Because it was liquid, he expected to drown in it, unaware that the density of molten metal is the same as solid metal. So he just skitted across the surface and fried to death. Brutal. Vlad the Impaler didn't stab a massive hole in you to prop you up on the stake. No, they shoved it up your asshole. Your intestines would be rearranged and eventually you would die of either sepsis or dehydration. Girl's hair got caught in a lathe and pulled her in. She was alone in the machine shop at night and the lathe kept spinning her what was left of her around until people came in the following morning. 2 universal rules of machine shops. Never be in the shop on your own and never have loose clothing or hair. Tuck that shit back. There was a video on WPD of a guy who jumped off a building to kill himself. He landed on a bollard which broke his fall enough to keep him conscious while dying of impalement. I read somewhere, maybe in a book of deaths at the Grand Canyon, about a woman who jumped trying to commit suicide. Unfortunately, she survived because she hit a ledge that wasn't quite far enough down to kill her. She had to crawl until she could find another edge to finish the deed. My aunt died in a car fire. She was driving drunk and went off the road and crashed her car. A fire started and the car was damaged to point where she could not exit. Firefighters arrived and one tried to pull her out by her arm but only got skin. It's awful to think about. Similar thing happened to a friend of mine. Many years ago when she was a toddler, she was in the car with her mother. They were in an accident and the car was wrecked. Her mum couldn't get out when a fire started. The mum climbed into the back seats and cloaked her body over that of my friend's. By the time emergency services got there, the mum was gone and my friend survived, but she was badly injured with burns over the majority of her body. Knew a guy in the Navy who said he saw someone get cut in half by a snapped cable. He was still alive for about a minute after it happened apparently. Severe radiation poisoning is pretty horrifying. It can take up to 2 weeks to kill you, during which time your body will fall apart at the molecular level while you're still alive. In some cases they can't even give you effective painkillers because your veins become so fragile they can't handle an injection. Oh, and just to f with you, you'll start to feel better after a couple days. But that's just the calm before your skin starts to die. The firefighter from Chernobyl, Ignatenko. I still feel like throwing up when I think about his final form. Not too far from where I used to live, a family all died. What happened was that, on their farm, the fecal lagoon had released a bubble of methane gas. It killed one kid who had wandered nearby. From what I remember, the kid fell into the lagoon, and then each family member tried to get to the kid, and they also were knocked out and fell into the fecal lagoon, where they all drowned. That guy that got stuck upside down in the cave for like 2 days. Since someone already said scaphism, my second worst one is strychnine poisoning. It can be inhaled, consumed, or absorbed through wet tissue like the nose, mouth, or eyes. It causes your voluntary nervous system to go into overdrive, which makes every muscle in your body contract and spasm uncontrollably. These spasms can be strong enough to rip the muscles off your bones. If untreated, death usually comes within 2 to 3 hours, either from asphyxiation, your chest muscles spasm so hard your ribs cannot expand, or from sheer exhaustion. There is no antidote to strychnine, although if caught immediately you can be put in sensory deprivation on massive doses of muscle relaxers. If you survive the first 24 hours, you usually live. If I saw a video once of someone who had committed suicide by rat poison, probably was on WPD, but I'll never forget that one. He's sort of hunched over, and there's just blood pouring out of his nose, mouth, but he's very conscious, head in his hands etc., over time from blood loss. And I guess the effects of the poison. He starts to look really delirious and leans back where he's sitting, and there's just blood leaking out of him. Everywhere. I think it thins your blood out. And he starts convulsing after a while, probably going into cardiac arrest. And it's just really long, and really drawn out. At some point I think someone tries to see if he's okay and quickly nopes out. Has to be probably one of the worst ways to decide to die. Was probably very desperate, and not very informed about the effects of the poison. It was just very horrible to watch. Dude tries to blow his head off with a shotgun. The first shot just blows most of his jaw off. But he lives. He gets up, walks to the bathroom mirror, looks at himself, reloads and finishes the job. That moment of looking in the mirror must have been pure hell. Particularly horrible considering a majority of suicide attempts the person decides they want to live when it's too late. It's sad to think after the first shot did he change his mind but then saw his face and thought F it, as he's just made his situation worse. That guy that was injected with adrenaline and was skinned alive in a prison riot. The Idaho National Lab incident. The No. 7 shield plug from the top of the reactor vessel impaled the third man through his groin and exited his shoulder, pinning him to the ceiling. Wiki. In Afghanistan there was a 12-year-old girl 14 years old Max that poured gasoline over herself and set herself on fire because her parents were forcing her to marry a 60-ish-year-old man. Worst part about it is not being able to do anything to help her. A friend of mine used to be a crime scene cleanup guy. He was once called in to clean up a car where an infant had been forgotten in a car during the summer in Kansas, where it was well over 100 degrees outside. Cars turn into ovens. He quit after that. My friend worked on the liver ward at the hospital. If you are suicidal and overdose on Panadol, Tylenol, it takes 3 days to die in extreme pain. She said they would have people in weekly who had taken a Panadol, Tylenol overdose and by the time they got to the ward they had changed their mind. So this person who now wanted to live died an agonizing death filled with shame in front of their friends and relatives. Dean Corll tortured his victims for extended periods of time. Some had glass inserted into the urethra and broken off. He favored little boys. Fatal familial insomnia. You slowly lose the ability to sleep and begin to physically and mentally waste away. As someone who suffers from insomnia, it absolutely terrifies me. This story is extremely disturbing and sad. Back when I was in 7th grade, I had this friend, Lazar, who was a year older than me. He had 3 siblings, 2 of which were much younger. He also lived pretty close to where I lived. It's important to note that we live on the countryside. One day, while we're at school, the principal and the teachers are freaking out. Kids are starting to cry. I asked one of the kids what happened, and I just stood there horrified for a moment. Turns out that Lazar's father was out on the field on a combine harvester working with his friend, when something got stuck in the rotary thresher. Lazar's dad went back there to check it out, but after a while his friend thought that he was done and just decided to turn the harvester back on. However, his leg sleeve got caught up in the thresher and started to quickly pull him in, basically crushing his leg and soon enough, his other leg as well. By the time his friend heard the screams and stopped the harvester, both of his legs were ripped off of his body and crushed completely. Only his upper half was left. His own son, Lazar, had to pick up what was left of his father and carry him to the car to get him to hospital immediately. His youngest child was there, watching all of this unfold, but I don't think he could comprehend it at the time. Having lived very far away from the nearest hospital, they had to basically meet the ambulance halfway there in order to not lose any precious time, since his father, by some miracle, was still alive, though unconscious, all the way there. His own son had to hold him in his arms and wrap him in his clothing and using his belt, trying desperately to stop the bleeding as much as he could. You can imagine how much this f***ed him up. His father passed away a few hours later if I remember correctly, and I was at school when this happened. Lazar's dad's friend was an idiot. I read a story about a man trying to rob a place by crawling through a sewer pipe. He became lodged in it with his hands around his waist trying to squirm through a narrow part. The rats found him, actually, just his face. They used his face as a buffet for days. There were a few dead rats around that he'd bitten to death because he couldn't use his hands. Other rats arrived to partake of the feast. He did not make it. Or there's always being skinned alive, aka flaying. Generally the victim starts with being left naked out in the hot sun for a day or two in order to get severe sunburn. If it's winter or just bad weather, a quick dunk in boiling water does the same thing. They're then strung up by the hands and a very sharp knife is used to make long straight incisions. The burn helps separate the skin from the underlying connective tissue. The skin is then peeled off from the muscle in large sheets using a hot knife. Between the burn and the hot knife, a skilled flayer could remove the skin with minimal blood loss, meaning the victim did not bleed out. Most common actual cause of death would then be hypothermia, as the skin is a vitally important part of your body's ability to regulate its temperature. Or if they were super unlucky, they'd die of sepsis, blood poisoning due to infection as much as days later. And of course the victim would be kept conscious during the entire procedure. While on a cherry picker training course, we were told a guy once fell out of the basket, didn't have his harness on correctly, and it lacerated his entire ballsack open. He died in hospital soon after because he also tore a major artery in his leg. Don't know how true this is, but it would be a nasty way to go. Tetanus sounds like a bummer of a way to die, only fatal 10% of the time, but bone-breaking spasms are part of the symptoms. Knew an old guy who lived alone. He had been walking around confused one day asking for someone to help him get an inhaler. They got him figured out and took him back home. The next thing we knew, he had died in the shower with the hot water still running days later. It was assumed he was having difficulty breathing and the hot moist air did not help him any, and he passed out and hit his head. He was found, with some parts of him floating in this sludgy mix which had accumulated over the days he was left under the water. Not the most horrible way I know or have seen, but still one that I hate to think about. At my local water park, a kid who was 10, same age as me at the time, drowned. Now the way he drowned is when he went down the water slide, and at the end when you slide into a pool there was the pipeline that sucks water back up to the top. Now this pipeline had a grate on it, but it sucked with great force. It used to pull kids towards it as you tried to swim out, and it was kinda a fun game to outswim it. Until one day a kid went under and got held onto the grate of the pipe and could not swim away. He drowned and was only found 20 minutes later when his mom went looking for him. This pipe was probably about 6 meters away from where you slide into the pool. Just the thought of being so small and helpless as you get held under and drown, and just watching other kids land in the pool and swim to safety, all having fun. I don't know, it just gets to me not even being able to call for help when it is so close. My cousin's baby starved to death before a year old. She never got comforted, never got any good baby food. She just got born into the world to heroin-addicted parents in a county with poor services, and then she died. I have seen a video of a man who got his testicles eaten by a pit bull. I saw this. If it's the same one, yes, it was cartel, and yes, it was because he did something to a young girl. They hung him upside down and then had the dogs eat out the whole crotch region. Insane. I couldn't watch it. He wasn't even freaking out. Just laying there dead inside. Bucket of rats on the stomach. They need to find a way out somewhere. That link is such a lovely shade of blue. It'd be a shame to click it and change it. But thanks. What happened to the Petty family in Cheshire? CT in 2007. 2 home invaders severely beat and restrained the father, had their way with the 11 and 17-year-old daughters. The mother strangled the mother and doused the girls with gasoline while tied to their beds and set the house on fire. 7 hours of this. Horrific. There was a Roman execution technique known as the body of death. For anyone interested, this is actually the allusion that the Apostle Paul makes in his letter to the Romans by saying, "Who shall free me from this body of death?" The punishment was often given to murderers, and it consisted of the body of the murdered victim being sewn onto the back of the murderer. Over time, the rot disease, maggots, etc. would move from the corpse into the living person's body, slowly killing them. Furthermore, anyone caught trying to help the person being punished would be subject to the same punishment. This is why Rome was truly the most metal empire to exist. I'll admit my information here is of apocryphal origin, so I looked into it more. The most legitimate historical reference I could find was this excerpt from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 7, published around 30 to 19 BC.